There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
The palace wasn't shaken by raised voices. It was shaken by the silence that followed. Just 5 minutes after a private confirmation reached the royal household, Prince William and Catherine shared an announcement no one had imagined they would ever have to make. King Charles's health had taken a heartbreaking turn, forcing the family into urgent discussions about duty, succession, and the future of the monarchy. What started as a confidential medical update quickly became the moment the public witnessed the royal family's deepest heartbreak. But that's only part of the story. William didn't rush to deliver the statement. He stood over it, staring at the words as though a single sentence could divide his life into before and after. Catherine stayed beside him, close enough to notice every change in his breathing, yet quiet enough to let him absorb the first wave of grief on his own. The senior royal duties, the official responsibilities carried out by working members of the royal family on behalf of the king, would now face an immediate review. Those words carried enormous weight. This was no ordinary health update. It was a sign the palace was preparing for the possibility that someone else might soon have to shoulder the crown's daily responsibilities. Catherine watched as William read the final line once. Then again. His grip tightened around the page before slowly easing, as if even his hands understood that no amount of frustration could change what was already true. Charles wasn't present when the confirmation was finalized, and somehow that absence spoke louder than any warning ever could. He had always been at the center of decisions like these. Now his silence became the clearest sign that something far more serious had unfolded behind the palace walls. The sealed health report arrived after a private palace briefing, a tightly controlled meeting where trusted medical advisors shared confidential information before any public announcement was considered. A medical advisor, simply put, is a doctor relied upon to guide official decisions whenever a royal's health begins affecting public duties. That detail mattered because this was no longer about rumors or growing concern. It was an official warning, serious enough that William and Catherine were informed before anyone else entered the room. At last, William lowered the paper onto the table. He didn't throw it down. He didn't interrupt the silence. That quiet restraint somehow made the moment even more heartbreaking. Catherine wasn't only looking at the future king. She was watching a son trying with everything he had to hide his grief before the country even knew what had happened. She understood that the words on that page would soon appear on television screens, across newspapers, and inside homes around the world. But before they belonged to the public, they belonged to a family whose hearts had already been broken. A private instruction spread through the household with remarkable speed. There would be no unnecessary movement, no public denial, and no off-the-record comments from any royal office until William addressed the nation. That order carried enormous importance because one careless remark could damage public confidence, while even the smallest false reassurance might make the tragedy appear hidden from view. The palace wanted control. The family wanted time. But Charles's condition had already taken both away. Before the final confirmation was released, William turned toward Catherine. She didn't offer a speech or search for comforting words. She simply stood beside him, steady and unwavering. That alone gave him what he needed. He knew that once those words were spoken, this would no longer be a private family tragedy. It would become the monarchy's burden, the nation's concern, and a test for everyone whose life was tied to the crown. And the moment William spoke, everything changed. The story was no longer only about Charles's health. It became a measure of every person standing closest to the throne. Inside the palace, the announcement touched each heart in a different way. For William, it reopened the fears of childhood in the hardest possible form. For Catherine, it became a moment to stand firmly beside her husband while the foundation beneath their family seemed to shift. For Charles, it was the painful reminder that not even a king has the power to stop time. And for Camilla, it marked the beginning of a loneliness that no royal title could ever ease. William continued staring at the draft, as though every sentence made the page feel heavier in his hands. In that moment, he wasn't standing there only as a son. He was standing there as the heir, the person next in line to wear the crown when the reigning monarch can no longer fulfill that role. That distinction mattered because Charles's health crisis had suddenly pulled the future much closer than anyone expected, not as a celebration, but as an overwhelming responsibility. The monarchy needed someone who could remain steady, and William knew every eye was already turning toward him. Catherine gently rested her hand over his. She wasn't trying to stop him. She was making sure he didn't disappear beneath the weight of what he was carrying. She understood his silence without asking him to explain it. She knew the difference between public duty and private sorrow. She recognized the moment he was carefully choosing words for the nation while locking away pain that belonged only to his family. Her quiet strength mattered because if William faltered, everyone else in that room would feel it too. Before the announcement moved forward, Charles had made one final request. He wanted William and Catherine to be the ones who confirmed the news, not a medical secretary, not a palace aide, not an emotionless official reading prepared lines. A palace aide, simply put, is a trusted member of staff responsible for helping manage royal duties and confidential instructions. That decision mattered because Charles wanted the future of the monarchy to speak with a single voice. He wanted the country to see strength, but also compassion. Camilla received the news separately. The queen consort didn't reach out for comfort. She remained seated as the door quietly closed behind her, her face drained of color, her hands perfectly still. In that moment, every royal title seemed powerless against the loneliness that had suddenly settled around her. Camilla had weathered countless storms beside Charles, but this one was unlike anything before. It wasn't fueled by rumors. It wasn't another chapter of family conflict. This time, it was the king's own health forcing the palace toward decisions that no one was emotionally prepared to face. Without a word, a senior aide quietly lifted Charles's public engagement folder from his desk. Public engagements are the official visits and appearances where members of the royal family represent the crown before the public. That simple gesture carried enormous meaning because it revealed what no one was willing to say aloud. Some of those appearances might never happen as planned. William noticed the empty spot on the desk. Catherine watched the expression on his face shift. Camilla remained alone after the door closed, listening to the silence and realizing that the familiar rhythm of royal life had been broken. The announcement had already shaken the palace, but the deepest pain still remained hidden beneath it. William sensed it. Catherine felt it. Charles had quietly prepared for it. And Camilla, left alone with the truth, slowly understood that the heartbreaking confirmation was only the beginning. To understand why those few words carried such devastating weight, the story had to return to the moment everything truly changed. Every crisis inside the monarchy has a single moment that, looking back, seems impossible to ignore. For this one, it wasn't a dramatic public collapse or a headline splashed across newspapers. It began during a private family dinner at Windsor that no cameras ever witnessed. The evening was meant to be calm. Charles reached for his glass, paused halfway through speaking, and turned toward William with an expression that instantly silenced the room. That was the moment no one present would ever forget. Charles had come to dinner determined to stay in control. He wanted one peaceful evening, one measured conversation, one opportunity to discuss future royal duties without fear spreading through the household. Future royal duties simply refer to the public work, state visits, ceremonies, and official appearances that keep the monarchy visible and functioning. That mattered because those responsibilities were more than dates on a calendar. They were living proof that the monarch remained capable of leading. William noticed the change before anyone gave it a name. He had been listening as Charles talked through scheduling matters when the king's voice suddenly weakened. Across the table, Catherine saw Charles brace his fingers against the edge as though determination alone was keeping him upright. She didn't interrupt. She didn't alarm the room. But in that instant, she knew this wasn't ordinary exhaustion. It was the body sending a warning to the crown. Charles tried to continue. He forced himself through another sentence before stopping once again. That second pause spoke louder than any admission ever could. William pushed back his chair. Not dramatically, not for attention, but with enough force that everyone heard it. The sound sliced through the silence. For one brief moment, the sun disappeared. and the protector stepped forward. Catherine saw the change immediately. She understood that the future king had crossed an invisible line, from quiet concern to taking command. The dinner ended far earlier than anyone expected. There were no lengthy explanations, no reassuring words, no attempt to soften what had just happened. After Charles returned to his private rooms, a confidential medical review was ordered. A medical review is a detailed examination by trusted doctors to determine what responsibilities the king could safely continue carrying. That decision mattered because the situation had moved beyond private concern and into official planning. The palace was no longer asking whether something was wrong. It was asking how much longer the truth could remain hidden. Later that evening, Catherine found William standing alone in a quiet corridor, his eyes fixed on Charles's closed door. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stood there, carrying the unbearable realization that a father's physical weakness could become a turning point for an entire nation. Catherine remained beside him without speaking. Her silence told him everything. She had witnessed the same moment. They both understood their family had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Behind closed doors, Charles's private team quietly began preparing a reduced duty plan without informing the wider household. The plan would gradually transfer some of the king's responsibilities to protect his health. That mattered because every responsibility passed to someone else would quietly tell the same story. The monarch was no longer as strong as the public believed. The dinner had exposed the fear. But what happened afterward revealed fractures the palace could no longer hide. The monarchy had survived scandals, resignations, family divisions, and national crises. Yet none of those challenges felt as dangerous as the private confrontation that followed confirmation of Charles's condition. There were no cameras, no carefully rehearsed smiles from a palace balcony, no polished statement crafted for the public. Only William, Catherine, Camilla, and Charles together in one room, with the truth resting between them like a blade laid across a table. Camilla was the first to break the silence. Before anyone else could speak, she demanded answers. The queen consort wanted to know why she hadn't been allowed to help shape the announcement's wording, why William and Catherine had been chosen to speak first, and why Charles's condition had been presented to the public with such painful honesty. The health confirmation, the official statement acknowledging the king's serious decline, mattered because it did more than explain his illness. It shifted the balance of trust inside the palace itself. Charles sat quietly beside a small table, visibly exhausted by everything unfolding around him. At first, he didn't interrupt. He listened as Camilla spoke. Then his eyes drifted toward William, who remained standing near the door, as though protecting both his father and the future waiting beyond him. William understood exactly why this conversation mattered. If the family broke apart in this room, the consequences would eventually reach the public. If the truth became something they used against one another, the monarchy itself would begin to bleed from within. Camilla insisted the statement had made Charles appear vulnerable. Fear filled her voice, but to William, it sounded like blame. When he finally answered, his voice remained calm. Yet beneath that calm was a quiet fury no one in the room could ignore. William answered the queen consort with calm conviction. He told her that concealing the truth would have made the family appear heartless, and that kind of cruelty would have harmed the crown far more than honesty ever could. Catherine noticed his jaw tighten. She watched Camilla's expression grow colder. In that instant, she realized sorrow was beginning to transform into blame. Before the disagreement could spiral any further, Catherine stepped in. She never raised her voice, yet the emotion behind her words filled the room. She reminded everyone that Charles was still there, still listening, still a human being beneath the weight of his title. That mattered because the monarchy had already demanded more from the king's body than anyone should have to give. It could not now force him to witness his own family arguing over how vulnerable he was allowed to appear. At last, Charles spoke. According to a documented private account later recorded by a senior household note-taker, the king revealed that he had personally approved William and Catherine's role in delivering the announcement. He believed they could protect both the monarchy and the people at the same time. The crown, meaning the royal institution and the responsibilities that come with it, needed one calm and dependable voice. In that moment, Charles made it unmistakably clear whose voice he trusted to carry that responsibility. There was no sense of victory on William's face, only heartbreak. Catherine stayed close, knowing this wasn't a triumph for either of them. It was another painful wound. Then Camilla was faced with a second truth. Several royal duties had already been reviewed, and some responsibilities could pass to William sooner than anyone had expected. She fell completely still. Because this was the part no one had dared say aloud. Charles lowered his eyes, and everything in the room changed. He hadn't simply confirmed his trust. He had quietly confirmed a transition. Camilla understood what it meant. Catherine felt its weight. William accepted the burden. From that moment forward, the crisis was no longer only about illness, grief, or family heartbreak. It had become a question of control. And inside the palace, control was often where the greatest danger lived. Power within the monarchy rarely arrives with dramatic speeches or thunderous announcements. More often, it moves silently through folders, signatures, schedules, and the simple question of who is invited into the room first. After the devastating health confirmation, one reality became impossible to ignore. William was no longer standing at the edge of history. History was pulling him forward. Beside him stood Catherine, calm on the outside, though visibly shaken, helping him shoulder responsibilities Charles could no longer fully carry. William sat with the duty folder resting open before him, yet he couldn't bring himself to turn the next page. He knew exactly what it represented. A duty folder is a confidential collection of schedules, official visits, and public responsibilities prepared for working members of the royal family. That mattered because it wasn't merely paperwork. Every page marked another place the king might no longer be able to attend. And every replacement quietly pushed the future king closer to a role he never wanted to accept under circumstances like these. Catherine watched him wrestle with the silence. She understood that stepping forward might appear strong to the public, but within the family, it felt like grief dressed in royal duty. She gently reminded William that protecting Charles didn't mean replacing him. It meant allowing the king the freedom to decide what strength still looked like. Those words mattered because while the monarchy needed stability, William needed permission to remain a son before becoming a symbol. Charles's reduced schedule was no longer being treated as a temporary pause. His condition had transformed it into both a constitutional and deeply emotional adjustment. Constitutional, in simple terms, refers to matters connected with the way the monarchy functions within the country's system of government. That distinction mattered because Charles wasn't only a father fighting to recover, he was the reigning monarch. And every cancelled engagement raised the same unspoken question: who would carry the work of the crown next? A palace aide entered quietly, carrying a marked list from Charles's office. According to a documented household account, the aide revealed that the king had already written William's name beside several official engagements long before the public announcement was made. Charles had recognized his own decline earlier than most people around him realized. He hadn't ignored reality. He had been preparing for it. That revelation struck William harder than any direct order ever could. It showed that while his father had been quietly enduring the pain of the present, he had also been planning for the future. William turned toward Catherine and finally admitted the truth he had kept buried throughout the morning. He confessed that he had never wanted this moment to arrive through suffering. Catherine didn't answer with easy promises or comforting allusions. Instead, she reminded him that Charles still possessed his dignity. He still had choices, and he still had a son capable of protecting both. William heard every word, but the burden didn't become lighter. It settled even deeper. Camilla came face to face with the changing reality when a decision that once would have reached her first was routed through William's office instead. She stood motionless after learning that certain instructions were now being reviewed by the prince before receiving final approval. She had feared illness. She had feared grief. But watching influence quietly shift without warning felt like an entirely different kind of loss. In that moment, she understood just how quickly a crisis could rearrange everything around her. Charles remained at the center of the monarchy, yet the machinery surrounding it had already begun turning toward William. Catherine saw it happening, Camilla felt it happening, and William could no longer convince himself that it was only temporary. Power hadn't arrived with a crown placed upon his head. It hadn't been announced through a grand speech. It had appeared through altered schedules, carefully chosen words, and a father silently preparing his son long before the world was ready to see it. By the following morning, the palace was no longer asking what had happened. It was struggling to respond to what could no longer be reversed. Morning had come, but inside the palace, nothing felt renewed. It felt wounded. News of Charles's declining health spread faster than anyone inside the palace could contain. Within the royal household, every hallway seemed filled with a different kind of unease. Staff members quietly exchanged whispers over changing schedules. Aides removed names from briefing papers. And Camilla, standing silently beside a window, realized the familiar rhythm of palace life had already begun to disappear. She watched as an aide carefully lifted Charles's next engagement card from the scheduling board. Camilla didn't ask him to stop. She simply stood there, watching it vanish, her expression slowly changing from disbelief into quiet sorrow. An engagement card is a scheduling note for an official royal appearance, and removing it meant the king might no longer be able to attend as planned. That mattered because Charles's absence would never remain hidden behind palace walls. Every empty chair would tell its own story. William received the first phone call before the household had even settled into the morning. He hesitated before answering, because every ring now sounded less like reassurance and more like preparation for what was coming next. A senior courtier, an experienced palace official trusted with important royal decisions, informed him that emergency changes to the royal schedule were already underway. That mattered because the family was no longer waiting to see how events unfolded. The palace itself had begun adjusting to the king's growing weakness. Catherine stood close enough to hear William's replies become shorter with every question. She knew those brief answers weren't signs of distance or indifference. They were signs of control. She understood he was being drawn toward a larger public role, not as a celebration, not as an honor, but as an urgent necessity created by Charles's condition. The future king was being asked to step forward while still desperately trying to remain a son. Catherine recognized the pain of that impossible balance before anyone else did. Charles's reduced responsibilities soon triggered a series of private calls to senior members of the royal family. The king had not disappeared from the center of the monarchy, but his condition required others to begin moving before the public fully understood the scale of the crisis. That mattered because the monarchy depends on continuity. Continuity means the crown must always appear stable, even when the family supporting it is anything but. William understood that. Catherine understood it as well. Camilla felt it most deeply when yet another folder quietly disappeared from Charles's desk. Behind closed doors, palace officials prepared two different versions of the next public statement. One offered cautious optimism. The other carried a far darker tone. A public statement is the official message released to the nation when the royal household wants to present a single, carefully controlled account of events. That mattered because the existence of two drafts revealed uncertainty. It meant no one could honestly promise reassurance. The next announcement might either comfort the country or deepen its concern. During a private briefing, Catherine learned that Charles had personally requested she remain beside William throughout every important meeting that followed. She accepted the information without outward reaction, but inside, its meaning struck deeply. The king wasn't placing his trust only in his son. He was trusting Catherine to steady William whenever the weight of duty became too much to bear. When Catherine quietly shared that request with William, he looked at her for a long moment. In that instant, titles no longer mattered. There was only the fear they both carried. Camilla once again found herself standing alone after the aide left the room. She realized grief was no longer hidden inside emotions alone. It had become visible through actions, engagement cards removed, phone calls made, statements rewritten. Every small decision revealed the same painful truth. William listened as the next instruction reached him, but he didn't move immediately. Catherine watched him collect himself before taking the next step. Behind a closed door, Charles waited with words only a father could speak. And when William finally entered the room without aides or advisors, everything suddenly became painfully simple. A king. his heir, and a conversation neither of them had ever wanted to have. For all the palace gates, centuries of tradition, formal titles, strict protocol, and carefully crafted statements, the real turning point arrived inside a room where none of those things mattered anymore. Charles wasn't simply the monarch. William wasn't only the future king. They were a father and his son, sitting close enough that silence revealed what pride never could. Outside the room, Catherine waited. For perhaps the first time, there was nothing left to shield the monarchy from the truth of its own grief. William entered alone because that was exactly how Charles had asked for it. Leaving Catherine outside the door was one of the hardest things he had done, even though every instinct told him he needed her quiet strength beside him. A private royal room, simply put, is a protected space where family conversations take place away from staff, advisors, and public scrutiny. That mattered because strategy had nothing to do with this moment anymore. This was a father trying to explain what fear had done to him. Charles looked at William with a gentleness rarely seen inside palace walls. He knew the announcement had changed everything. He also knew his son had carried the first wave of that burden before the entire nation. Now the monarchy had no choice but to adapt to a painful new reality. In other words, both the family and the institution had to prepare for reduced royal duties, changing responsibilities, and an even heavier burden resting on the shoulders of the heir. That mattered because no one could continue pretending this was simply a difficult chapter. A new era had already begun, and it had begun through heartbreak. Charles quietly apologized to William, not because he was ill, not because he needed help. He was sorry that this responsibility had arrived wrapped in fear instead of careful preparation, forcing his son to face the future far sooner than either of them had ever hoped. William lowered his head before he finally answered. He admitted he wasn't afraid of the responsibility itself. What frightened him was losing his father beneath the weight of it. Those few words swept away every layer of royal formality. For that brief moment, there was no crown standing between them, only a father and a son bound together by love under impossible pressure. Charles reached across and gently took William's hand. It was a quiet gesture, but it carried the weight of years filled with emotions neither of them had ever found easy to express. The king had spent his entire life shaped by duty, while William had learned from an early age how heavy silence could become. Now, there was nowhere left to hide from the truth. Charles was still the monarch, but in that room, he was simply a father, asking his son to find courage before either of them truly felt ready. Later, through a recorded private family conversation preserved in palace notes, Charles explained why he had chosen William and Catherine to deliver the heartbreaking announcement. He wanted the public to see continuity wrapped in compassion. Continuity means the monarchy continues to appear stable, even when one person must step back. That mattered because the country needed reassurance. But Charles also believed the people deserved honesty. He wanted them to see the future taking shape without feeling that the present had abandoned them. William listened without saying a word. He understood that Catherine had not been chosen simply for appearances. She had been chosen because she represented strength. Charles trusted her judgment, her calm under pressure, and her ability to keep the future king steady whenever grief threatened to overwhelm him. The king also made one point unmistakably clear. Camilla deserved protection from unnecessary humiliation, but she could not be allowed to shape the emotional truth of the announcement. Her pain mattered deeply, yet the nation deserved honesty more than the palace deserved comfort. When the conversation came to an end, William rose slowly from his chair. There was no relief in his expression, only change. Charles watched his son leave with both pride and sorrow in his eyes. The man who had entered the room carried fear. The one who walked out carried resolve. The moment the door opened, Catherine looked at William and understood everything before he spoke a single word. The conversation they had both dreaded had finally happened. But beyond the palace walls, the country had already begun deciding what it all meant. By midday, The story had escaped every attempt to contain it. It spread into homes, taxis, cafes, offices, and busy streets where people stopped scrolling through their phones and simply stared at the news. The heartbreaking confirmation about King Charles's health was no longer just another royal announcement. It had become a moment that brought the entire nation to a pause. Outside Buckingham Palace, people gathered quietly, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge something far more profound. An era itself seemed to be trembling. William watched the first public reactions unfold on a muted television screen. For several long moments, he remained completely still. The announcement dominated every broadcast because he and Catherine had chosen not to hide behind a written palace statement. They had carried the truth themselves. A royal update, simply put, is an official message issued by the palace about an important matter affecting either the royal family or the crown. That mattered because this wasn't an announcement about ceremonies, travel, or celebrations. It was about the king's health and the future of the monarchy. Catherine stood beside William as broadcasters replayed his statement again and again. One presenter described the moment as one of the greatest tests the monarchy had faced in years, pointing to William's quiet restraint and Catherine's unwavering presence at his side. That observation mattered because people were no longer judging only the news itself. They were deciding who appeared ready to carry the burden. Catherine quietly realized that even her silence had become part of the message. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, a small crowd slowly grew. An elderly woman stepped forward and placed a single white rose against the railings before softly saying that Charles had looked tired for far too long. For anyone unfamiliar, Buckingham Palace is one of the monarchy's best-known working residences and one of the strongest public symbols of royal life. That mattered because people don't gather there without reason. They came because the king's illness had suddenly made that powerful symbol feel deeply human. William watched the scene for only a moment before turning away. He wasn't embarrassed by his grief. He was shaken because complete strangers had seen what he had been trying to carry privately ever since that evening at Windsor. Catherine noticed the change immediately and stayed beside him without speaking. She understood that addressing a nation was one challenge. Facing a nation's heartbreak for his own father was something entirely different. Soon afterward, newspapers appeared with a striking front-page headline. "The King steps back. William and Catherine lead the nation through pain." Those words echoed throughout the palace because they made the transition feel real long before every official decision had been announced. A front page is the first page of a newspaper, where the day's biggest story is placed for everyone to see. That mattered because the public had already chosen the image that would define the moment. One broadcaster went even further, saying the defining picture of the day wasn't a crown, a palace balcony, or a golden carriage. It was Catherine standing beside William as he delivered the most painful statement of his life. She later heard those words repeated during a recorded media briefing, and they unsettled her. She had never stood there hoping to become a symbol. She stood there because William needed her, because Charles trusted her, and because, in that moment, the country needed someone who could quietly represent calm. From another room, Camilla listened as the public reaction continued to grow. The Queen Consort could feel the nation slowly placing its hopes in William and Catherine. The realization stung, but deep down, she understood exactly why it was happening. Charles's illness had brought uncertainty to the palace, and whenever fear takes hold, people search for someone who can provide stability. Charles had already decided where that stability should come from. The world reacted with shock to the announcement, but the true measure of that moment belonged to those who had lived through the heartbreak from inside the crown itself. In the end, the confirmation of King Charles's declining health did not break the monarchy. It revealed it. It uncovered the fear hidden beneath centuries of ceremony, the love that existed beneath duty, and the painful price of a crown passed forward through hardship rather than celebration. William and Catherine did far more than announce difficult news. They carried their family through one of its most deeply human moments, and in doing so, they reshaped what leadership looked like. Charles accepted his reduced role with quiet grace. After signing the revised duty plan, he carefully set down his pen and looked toward William, not with defeat, but with unmistakable pride. A revised duty plan is an updated list of royal responsibilities created to protect the monarch's health while ensuring the crown continues to function without interruption. That mattered because this wasn't an act of surrender. It was a father choosing honesty over pride, a king choosing the future over appearances. William didn't return his father's look with a smile. He understood exactly what it meant. Succession, in simple terms, is the order determining who assumes the crown when the reigning monarch can no longer fulfill that role. That mattered because people no longer viewed it as a distant royal tradition. They now saw it for what it truly was, a living responsibility carried by real people facing real fear, real grief, and real love beneath every title. Catherine remained beside William afterward. She didn't speak for him, and she never tried to take the moment away from him. Instead, she quietly gave him the strength to remain composed whenever grief threatened to break through. She had become more than a reassuring presence. She had become the quiet foundation helping the future king remain steady as private family sorrow became a defining national moment. William knew it, Charles knew it, and everyone inside the palace could feel it. Camilla's heartbreak was no less real. She had lost the familiar rhythm she once shared with Charles, and she had watched responsibility move toward William and Catherine faster than she was emotionally prepared to accept. But in time, she came to understand the hardest truth of all. Protecting the king meant embracing the future he had already entrusted to them. Her pain didn't disappear. She simply stopped resisting what she knew was true. Long before anyone else fully understood what was happening, Charles had already begun preparing for this transition emotionally. According to a documented private account preserved in palace records, his decision reflected one guiding principle above all else. He chose compassion instead of secrecy at the moment it mattered most. He never wanted the monarchy to hide behind carefully polished words. He wanted the nation to see honesty, to see steadiness, to see a family standing together when it mattered most. William carried that honesty. Catherine gave it grace. Charles gave it his blessing. And Camilla, though still carrying her own sorrow, came to understand that sometimes the deepest act of love is letting go of control. This was never simply a story about the health of a king. It became the moment William and Catherine emerged as the emotional guardians of the crown. By the end, no unanswered questions remained. Charles gave the monarchy honesty. William gave it strength. Catherine gave it grace. Together, they transformed a moment of heartbreak into a lasting example of dignity, resilience, and quiet leadership. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next update. We'll see you in the next video.